How do you find a podcast or a podcast episode on Spotify, Apple, Google? Is there a better search engine or podcast database where we can find interesting episodes, especially when those episodes are around a specific topic? Recently on Twitter, Clueless said, "I don't believe discoverability is the problem. There is a big problem with podcast search. When you know what you want and can't find it due to the dreadful podcast search engines. The best search engine is Google, and it's not very good. Podcast app search is utterly trash." So I thought what I would do is I would test out searching for a specific topic on different podcast apps. And as a topic, I thought I would search for Podcast Movement 2022. This is the conference that I just attended. It's the biggest podcast conference in the world, I believe. And you would think that there would be lots of episodes recapping what happened at Podcast Movement. So let's go through the different apps, the different directories, the different search engines, and see how broken podcast search and discoverability is. All right, we're going to start with Apple Podcasts here on my desktop, and we're going to search for Podcast Movement 2022. All right, so what did we get here? We got a bunch of shows, but what I'm looking for is specific episodes. And when we go down here, these results do not seem great. We've got some sports. We're obviously ranking for the word movement here. Let's try to sharpen this search. We'll put quotes and we'll put podcast movement. The idea here is in quotation marks, it should just find us the entire search term, podcast movement, instead of separate words, but we're still not getting very good results here. Just to be fair, let's search on the mobile app. Yeah, we're getting a lot of the same results we got before, and again, nothing in the top results here that are related to podcast movement. All right, let's go to Spotify next and see how their search engine compares to Apple's. So again, we're going to search for podcast movement, and let's see what we've got here. So episodes, this looks like it's a exercise podcast. Again, not getting anything about podcast movement. Let's try to put it in quotation marks and see if we get better results. All right, finally, we're getting one podcast here about podcast movement. I think it's by Podcast Movement. That's the first kind of actual result so far. And in terms of episodes, there was some Ben Shapiro drama at Podcast Movement, so that might be why that's showing up. So here's one result where Podcast Movement was in the episode description, the Podcast Movement controversy. I'm really surprised that there's not more. You'd think with all these podcasters going to the event, you'd think there would be lots of folks podcasting after an event like this about Podcast Movement, the conference. Just to be fair, let's take a look on the app. We're looking at podcasts and shows. Again, these results just seem all over the place. Lots of results just for the word movement. And then I'm guessing podcast is just another keyword we're hitting here. Not a very smart search engine. Let's go to the king of search, Google, and specifically Google Podcasts, and see if we can find anything on podcast movement here. So podcast movement. All right. Now we're actually getting some good results here. So, of course, we've got Ben Shapiro controversy, live from Podcast Movement, another Ben Shapiro, another what? But at least we're getting some Podcast Movement episodes here. For example, maybe this one here, what I learned at Podcast Movement Conference, is something I'd be interested in as an attendee or as someone who wants to attend the conference. The top result is Podcast Movement Sessions, which is what you would expect. And also interesting that they're highlighting the top search right at the top here in this special area. That's an interesting SEO, search engine optimization trick for podcasters. If you have the exact keywords, Google might actually give you a special banner section at the top. I'm a little disappointed we can't get more episode results. Let's try Google search itself. So podcast movement episode. We're getting some stuff from YouTube. And then here in the podcast section, live from Podcast Movement newsletter, we're actually getting a lot of better results in this little section. It seems like these are great search results for those keywords. Yeah, and all fresh content, lesson from day one of Podcast Movement. This is kind of what I would expect from, the search results. It's the Podcast Movement recap episode. So they're actually doing a fairly good job of matching episode descriptions to the term I'm searching. It's odd that I wouldn't have seen more of those results here for episodes. I had to go to actual Google search to see these. They're just in this little section here. So interesting. So now we've covered the big 3 podcast apps directories. That would be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google. Google definitely wins that round. However, there are other search engines and directories online, and it might be worth checking those out as well. All right, next up is Listen Notes. They call themselves the best podcast search engine. So we're going to look for Podcast Movement, and we're looking for episodes. Let's hit enter. So we're seeing a good result at the top, but then when we scroll down, you can see it's just matching movement and podcast separate from each other. Let's go and put this in quotation marks and see if that gives us a better result. Okay, here we go. Podcast Movement, Podcast Movement, Podcast Movement 2021 recap. Lots of results here for Podcast Movement as a keyword. Again, this is exactly the kinds of results I'm looking for. I'm looking for episodes that are talking about this specific event. And Listen Notes, I think, once we qualified that search with quotation marks, Listen Notes is the winner so far. Okay, let's go to Podchaser next. And we'll search for Podcast Movement. And we want an exact match. Okay, so if you put it in quotation marks, you get an exact match. Here we go. Podcast Movement. Podcast Movement. We're getting results from all the way back in 2015. Can we sort this by recent? Let's released in the last 60 days. All right, so we're getting some good results here on Podchaser. We've got episodes from 11 days ago, 12 days ago, some people recording live from Podcast Movement. It's interesting that a lot of these are different than what we saw here on Listen Notes. These seem like good results. I might check some of these out if I was interested in it. All right, let's try some other apps. We've got Overcast. Let's see what happens when I type in podcast. See how Overcast search does. Okay, no, getting a lot of movement related. Let's see if we qualify it. We are getting some specific Podcast Movement episodes. It looks like some Wolf Den, recap from Sounds Profitable. Not bad, but not awesome either. We got a handful of episodes. It looks like mostly from podcasts I was subscribed to. So it searches for, what I already have in my library, and then it's matching episodes based on that. Now we're going to try searching on Pocket Casts. So here we're getting a bunch of show results. Podcast Movement, these are the actual podcasts with a bunch of episodes. but it doesn't seem like they have episode level search. Let's give Amazon Music a try. Let's see how good their search is. One result at the top that's okay. Rest of these do not seem very good. Let's try Goodpods. Okay, so we're getting some results for shows. We've got all the Podcast Movement sponsored shows. And here in the episode titles, pretty good actually. We're getting a bunch of results, and they're giving us exact matches for those keywords, Podcast Movement. Lots of episodes here. So well done to Goodpods. All right, so who wins when it comes to podcast search? I think that Google Podcasts takes first place when it comes to the big apps. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google wins that round. When it comes to these third-party search engines, I think Listen Notes and Podchaser both did a pretty good job of surfacing podcast episodes on a specific topic. Hopefully all of this has been interesting to you. I'm Justin. I am the co-founder of Transistor.fm. It is podcast hosting and analytics. If you're looking for a modern user interface, a built-in website for your podcast, and if you want to start as many podcasts as you want and only pay one price, check out Transistor. You can start a 14-day free trial by going to transistor.fm.